Something that separates pros from amateurs is that amateurs play the game one street at a time. They base their decision in the moment when each card hits rather than looking at the big picture. Pros, on the other hand, generally have a plan for the entire hand once the flop comes out. A pro decides how he will play each street depending on which types of cards can come, his opponent type, his opponent's stack size, and how many opponents he's facing in the pot. Once the flop is out, the pro knows all possible outcomes of the hand and navigates the pot size to follow his plan. If your opponents will let you control the action, as is often the case with bad players, you can always determine whether you will play a small pot or a big pot, according to what seems optimal at the time. Based on your opponent type, opponent's most likely hand, and finally your hand, you will base your decision and plan the hand accordingly. So here I've drawn a poker matrix, if you will, and on the top here we have the pot size as it grows with each bet in a hand, and then we have the street that we are on. We start with pre-flop and we can work our way down to the flop, turn, or river with the appropriate pot size based on what action has come. All I'm really trying to show here is that if the appropriate actions are taken, we can decide how big the pot will be on the river if the hand gets that far. Now, we don't have so much control that we can ensure a pot is only like 2 big blinds on the river, as our opponents also have the option to raise the pot just like we do. But in a heads-up pot, we can be 100% sure that the pot will never be bigger than 4 bets, which would be the pre-flop bet, the flop bet, the turn bet, and the river bet. And often we can even keep it smaller than that. So this green line here represents the way the pot would grow according to street if one opponent is just calling or we're just calling while the other player in the hand just bets. So, for each raise or bet we move to the right, and for each call we move down the matrix to eventually get a stack size pot by the river. So like getting to the river is almost like a team effort. You and your opponent must agree on a fair price for the hand to progress to future streets. Fortunately, the goal in poker isn't to make it to the river, so we don't need to work with our opponent. Our goal is always to win the pot at any time and end the matrix for that particular hand. The earlier we win the pot, the less luck of the cards will come into play. And making our opponent fold is our goal because, number one, we win the money at limited risk. Number two, we don't have to show our hand, thus we don't give away information. And number three, we can't get unlucky and get sucked out on, which is also going to make us less likely to tilt, which is definitely good for our long run game. So, as I said before, the matrix works with the bets going to the right and checks and calls moving us downwards, and the green line representing a pot controlled, pot, where the players don't both want to play a big pot, so it grows at a reasonable rate if we make it to the river. That is one player checking and calling at every opportunity they have, while the other player bets at every opportunity they're presented. So even if our opponent wants to play a small pot, we can still force them to play, pretty much an all-in pot by the river by just betting the maximum when it's our turn, every time it's our turn. And if they can't stand the heat, well, they can get out of the kitchen and we'll take the money. Also, if we have an opponent who wants to raise the stake, the pot can grow all in on any street. As you can see here, we bet, they raise, we re-raise, they re-raise, we're all in. Or we get to the flop after it's been limp and call pre-flop, and we both flop set, so bet, raise, re-raise, re-raise, we're all in. At any point in the hand, you can get all in. It doesn't matter what street you're on. So pots can grow. They can grow real fast as long as both players are willing parties. So this is important because you must realize when you're in position and have the option to check. But if you bet, our opponent now has the option of making it 2 bets on that street. And on the matrix, you can see how big 2 bets really affects the pot size. Like, you'd get a pot that's 10 times as big, whereas if you checked it back, you know that the biggest the pot's going to get is like 3 times as big as it currently is. So, pots grow very fast and they can become all-in pots at almost any time. That's why having a plan for the hand is important. Most of your opponents won't be aware of how the pots grow so specifically as I've shown you here. So having a strong understanding of this allows you to take advantage of their ignorance and control the pot size to your liking. Now that I've briefly gone over my poker matrix, which I will make available on the site if you guys want it, although it is pretty simple, let's move on to actually playing out a hand. So, playing with the lead. As I've said before, typically the ideal outcome is simply to make our opponent fold and win the pot. The earlier they fold, streetwise, the lower our risk. However, the later they fold, if we've been building the pot, the larger our reward will be. Ideally, we just want to be giving our opponent multiple chances to fold in the hand, each time keeping our risk to a minimum, while the reward will continue to grow if they call. Like, if we bet half pot on the flop, as you guys should know from our bluffing lesson, we only need to win 1 time out of 3 to break even. But let's say our opponent calls. Okay, whatever. If the spot's right, we can fire half pot again on the turn, and once again, with this bet, we still only need to win 1 out of 3 to break even on that bet. But since our risk in our bet size is bigger because the pot's bigger, our reward, in turn, will also be bigger if we succeed. But, even if they call the flop but fold to the turn, we're still profiting. So, by betting small but betting frequently, we're keeping the odds in our favor. As I've said before, betting is done in poker to acquire information, as well as to build a pot and to try to make our opponent fold. If it weren't for betting, it would be extremely hard to figure out what our opponent has. That's why it's a necessary part of the game. So I'll put it this way. Bet early and bet often. As you know from the matrix that I showed you before, bets are smaller on the early streets, unless we've checked the flop or something, check the turn, and then it's like the first bet's going in on the river. But generally speaking, bets are smaller on early streets, and they will also allow us to narrow our opponent's hand range, their potential holdings they could have. The sooner we can put our opponent on exactly what they have, or a very narrow range of specific hand types, like they only have a set here, the sooner we can make the appropriate assessment of the situation and know whether to push forward or get out. If we can get our information early, we can get it cheaply, and thus we will make the proper decisions when the bets start getting big, but we didn't have to pay too much for the information to make the proper decision later in the hand. Always bet for a reason. Don't just bet because it's fun.